Is that showing up for you okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So at one point, I'm going to actually switch over to live video, and that'll be via my phone, which is broadcasting now. And let's pray that this works. But I think it should be okay. So here we go. Welcome, everybody. It's great to be here, and I'm actually going to move this around a little bit. In fact, I'm going to turn off my video because you don't need that. So this is about the Cascade Division circa 1955, a very large and ambitious layout that I've been planning for, 20 years now, and construction started in earnest in about 2008. So I've been at it for a while, and I'm going to go through a little bit of the historic background of the area I'm modeling and also some of the principles of the layout design. Then I'm going to show you some track plans so you can get oriented as to how we're actually bringing this to life. Then I'm going to give you a live tour of the layout, walking around to see kind of the state of affairs. And then I'll return to finish up and take questions. And as I understand it, Tom, I've got 55 minutes, so we should be able to have a lot of fun here. Okay, so the modeled area in 1955 was the first subdivision of the Cascade Division, and that extended from Seattle Railroad east, physically north to Everett, and then on to Wenatchee. In this era, 1955, there was still an electric district between Skykomish and Wenatchee, and obviously diesel power between Seattle and Skykomish. We cheat a little bit. Cascade Division steam was gone a couple of years earlier than that, but we have some steam on the layout as well. So, sue me. It's my layout, my rules. I definitely wanted to have domes in the Empire Builder, so that's why I chose 1955. But this is a really interesting area. Some of you know it well, some of you don't. But what's interesting is between Seattle and Wenatchee, you have a lot of different physical environments and a great deal of operating interest. So sure, I live in Seattle, but I haven't all my life, but I've always been fascinated by the railroading between Seattle and Wenatchee, because you start with a relatively big city in Seattle, lots of industrial switching, big yard with interbay, engine terminal, major passenger station shared with the Northern Pacific. And you run along Puget Sound in a marine climate to Everett, and then you start heading east into foothills of the Cascade Mountains. And in those foothills, you have a series of small towns, which in this era had lots of little local industry. I'll talk about some of those during the presentation. And then you have a mountain railroad between Skykomish, up and over the hill through Cascade Tunnel and down, 2.2% grades, serious mountain railroading with helpers, electric locomotives and so forth. And then on the east side of the Cascades, down through towns like Leavenworth and Kashmir and so forth, you're in essentially high desert with orchard country in the Wenatchee River Valley and on to Wenatchee itself on the Columbia River. So the diversity is absolutely fascinating and arguably justifies building a big, ambitious layout to model it, but you can be the judge of that. So let's talk about the layout priorities. And I should point out that compared to brilliant modelers like Scott Kramer and some others in the society, my focus is really on operations. I'm not uninterested in scenery, and I actually like building scenery, but the purpose of this layout was primary operations. So, and you'll see this in the layout tour. Right now, I'm really focused on perfect track work, good paperwork, really building a layout that allows us to have op sessions that bring it to life. So in order of importance for me was first prototypical dispatching via timetable and train orders, which was the technique used then. And I've spent a lot of my own research time on how exactly this railroad was operated then, how the paperwork worked, how the rule book interacted with operations. Now, one of the things about train orders, if you're building a model railroad, it is tough to pull off with a small model railroad. So this is one of the arguments for going crazy and building a big railroad. I don't think everybody should build a big model railroad. We'll talk about that in a moment. But if you want to do timetable and train orders, you really need sufficient time to write the freaking orders, for one thing. if you're Dave Sprouse sitting in Seattle Dispatch, or Jimmy Fredrickson sitting in Tacoma writing orders for the Northern Pacific, you'd be planning hours in advance. And, you had time, although it could get very stressful on a busy railroad, to think up your plan and to write those orders. If you've got a model railroad with 5 feet between sidings, it doesn't really work. So I planned for a very long main line to make that make sense. I also, because Seattle was the western terminus of the Great Northern, I wanted to model interbay yard and have that major yard switching. Having run on a lot of other people's model railroads, I really love running yards. It's fun. So let's go for it with interbay. Then, of course, the electrified district and helpers. One of my concerns was good quality models available. There were those nice Tenshoto Y1s back in the day, but there's some work to get them to run well. I was kind of bailed out by PSC, who came out about 6 years ago with a complete line of Z's and Y's and even a new version of the W electric locomotive that run really well. And so we're going to be set there after I put decoders in them. And then local industrial switching is fun. Those of you who traveled op sessions know that the local typically gets first when people are bidding for jobs. Prototypical signaling and interlockings. I really have to blame Ron Farrell for this, among others, getting me into this. I'm an engineer by training anyway, electrical and computer. So this is a bit of a side hobby, is really understanding the relay logic and so forth. So this will come later. I haven't really begun that part of the layout, although my signaling districts and interlockings and so forth have all been planned in advance. Then signature passenger trains. How can you not have the Empire Builder? Interchange, it turns out, is an under-remarked aspect, I think, of the Cascade Division. Not only was there a serious amount of interchange within the city of Seattle with the Northern Pacific, the Union Pacific, the Pacific Coast, Union Pacific, Milwaukee, sorry, but also at Everett. And then there were running rights from both the Milwaukee between Everett and Monroe, and then Northern Pacific between Everett and Snohomish. So that's pretty cool. And then block setouts and pickups. This is something a lot of modelers skip, and you shouldn't, because it's really interesting. This notion of a road train, and this was permitted by rule to make one move, actually a set out on a pickup at intermediate points without having to get extra time and pay. And there was a real interesting set out pickup operation at Everett and Lowell in both directions on this railroad, which I'm trying to model. And then kind of the last priority, I'm doing it because I have to, but it's tough coupling and uncoupling cars with diaphragms. But if you're going to model King Street, you kind of got to make up the trains and break them up. So we've got that modeled as well. All right, what I'm going to do now, by design, a lot of you know I've been really active with the archives. As with all of us in life, I think partly for selfish reasons, because I needed to do lots of research. And so I got involved really early. Bob Kelly has definitely, stepped to the fore on that in recent years. But early on, I was involved with Jackson Street and PNRA and have, always been looking for great paperwork and photos. So I thought to myself, going into this presentation, maybe I shouldn't show you all the photos you've all seen before. Everybody focuses on the electrics at Sky and so forth. So I went digging in my own notes for photos that I thought you probably haven't seen before, and I could be wrong. So I'm going to illustrate the railroad with some kind of fun photos that are a little off the beaten track and have generally not been published. This one I couldn't find, and y'all can send me an email if you know the credit on this photo, but this is an eastbound train leaving Interbay Yard. And you can see a lot of modeling detail in this if you really zoom in. The caboose track on the right. You'll notice at the end of the caboose track are some non-cabooses, a couple of what look to be repurposed coaches, which are probably used for a work train. You can also date the photo because you can see the caboose track at the other end is double-ended. That was actually not the case in 1955. They chopped out that switch. You can see that this train is going through two crossovers to get onto the main line. It's first going onto the B lead, actually first the office lead. From right to left, there's the caboose track, the office lead, the B lead, and the main line. and it's winding through that. And I'll show you in a moment how we've modeled that on the railroad. Now let's look at some other things. I did show this in my last presentation, which was a while ago, a few years ago at a convention, but it's cool because people like talking about the big icing facilities at Wenatchee and at Whitefish, and those are pretty well known. Well, Seattle had one too. Wasn't very big, but it was just to the railroad east of Inner Bay Yard, and you can see it here. The late Virgil Love took some photos back in 1955 as a young man, and I got a few of those, and you can see here the small icing dock right at Inner Bay Yard, and they would use those to re-ice reefers that were continuing on to California generally. There was some reefer traffic that went west from Wenatchee to serve Seattle and California with, apples and so forth that maybe weren't as prevalent in California. And of course, there was some reefer traffic, produce and so forth from California north to Seattle. So there was a need for re-icing facilities in Seattle, and we're modeling that track. Then there's my favorite train, one of the favorites whenever people come over for operating sessions, the Oiler. And this is a train that was a 16-hour job. I had the privilege of interviewing a gentleman who worked this train in the late 50s and 60s. It was a 16-hour job that left Inner Bay around 5 o'clock in the morning, would run often all the way out to Monroe, switching various facilities on the way and back. They'd have lunch at Inner Bay, and then they'd go out and do it all over again. And they'd sign out at 15:59 typically, and then they would get their rest, which usually meant about 5 hours of sleep, not 8, and they do it all over again, 6 days a week. And the train order for this train was absolutely insane. I have a vintage copy of it. It's basically you on the railroad between Seattle and Everett, not protecting against extras except for dispatcher would list about 9 extras he expected to run that day. It was absolutely insane. They used both main tracks. They typically stick a flag in the coupler of a tank car. They did not worry about where the caboose was in the train. They didn't have time to mess around with that. So good modeling input. The Oiler behind a little, often a little 280 would sometimes go out with 80 cars, and they'd switch Point Wells, they'd switch Edmonds, they'd switch the fuel dealers in Monroe. Just a great train. We usually run a diesel on that, but here's a vintage photo that along Puget Sound that's just great. Now, this is a little out of my era, but I'm going to do a shameless promotion for the auction right now, because you'll notice the third car in this train is the famous pendulum car, a model of which is being auctioned on the auction site. I can tell you, since it took me 12 years to find one, that is a very rare model. And if you want one, you should just close your eyes and bid whatever it takes, because they don't come up very often. I managed to snag one from the late Dwayne Buck and ended up painting it, but it's a really cool model. It's like the Talgos. It's a swing pendulum car that actually banks automatically on the curves. The Great Northern bought one, and another railroad, I've forgotten which, bought another, and that was kind of it for that particular model in the late 40s, circa 1950. But this is the Puget Sounder, a predecessor to the International, running up Puget Sound northward in 1950. Okay, here's a great shot of Everett. And Everett is important operationally because just railroad west of Everett was Everett Junction, which is where the double track main line of the Great Northern split high and low. The high line, which you can see above the nose of the switcher, went up to the Everett Depot, and then past this point, it curved to the right and went through a tunnel under downtown Everett. That was the Great Northern main line. The switcher is on the coastline, and trains took this line to head north to Vancouver. So to the left of the caboose, this track continues through Bayside Yard, up to Delta Junction, and then on to the land of Tom Carr with the facilities in Vancouver. So to model that, leaving Inner Bay, a train might be going on the main line or on the coastline. I don't model much or really anything north of Everett. On the model, you'll see trains will take the low line or the coastline, and they'll kind of disappear and go down a helix into staging. But you can see, if you look, going through puberty, you can see there's actually platforms on both levels here. So back in the day, if you were taking a train to Vancouver, you'd check in, show your ticket at the station on the upper level, and then you'd go downstairs and through a tunnel, which would take you out on this lower level platform to get those trains. The Empire Builder and Western Star, of course, would stop on the upper level, and they even had an elevator for baggage carts. Pretty cool situation. You can date this photo as past 1950. I think 59 was the year, because the tower is missing from the Everett Depot. There was a beautiful tower that they removed in the late 50s. All right. I don't know if Dave Sproul is on this thing, but this is my tribute to him because he has been invaluable in researching a couple specific things. The operations of the Great Northern as they were in the 50s with timetable and train order, and then his hometown of Monroe. And what you can see below is a track map, and this is from one of the Great Northern reference sheets of Monroe as it was then. And if you look carefully, you can see track capacities listed and all kinds of little spurs and so forth. There's a great deal of industry, single car railroading in this area. In this era, the Skykomish local would typically switch Monroe on its way through, and it might bang cars for 2 or 3 hours. So there's a lot going on in Monroe. The only thing left of all of this today are the main siding. And then if you look in the kind of a right side, you can see a little spur popping above the main line that says 8 cars. That's Wolfkill Feed and Seed, and they still take the occasional car from the BNSF, so that's cool. And then the little spur marked 6, that is now just a single-ended spur where BNSF will occasionally put a carload of gravel or a bad order car, but that's it. Everything else is gone, including the Milwaukee Road tracks. So a very interesting area. And the above photo, you can see a couple things of modeling interest. Well, you can see Wolfkill Feed and Seed. You can also see a water tower there. This is a point, again, that we often miss. It's pretty common on the railroads to have a separate water tank that would sit back from the tracks and then pipe the water to a standpipe along the tracks. It's especially useful if you wanted to have more than one watering location, which is really common. And that's what we had here in Monroe. You can see the standpipe in the foreground, but it's getting its water from the tank in the distance. Anyway, lots to see in this photo. Now, I had to show a photo of Skykomish, and everybody on this call has seen a million pictures of electrics in Skykomish. So let's show you a picture of diesels in Skykomish, which are absolutely as prevalent because that's how the trains got there from Seattle. So by God, I'm not going to show you a picture of an electric. I'm going to show you 3 Jeeps of my modeled era, and I have models of these thanks to Walthers and Proto 2000 of the 600 series. This is looking east, and it's pretty obvious what's happened here. This is one of the back tracks in Skykomish Yard. So these 3 Jeeps have most likely just been taken off a train and are making their way back on the back tracks to lay over and wait for another westbound train to take down the hill. It's also possible that it's a helper set, but actually it's not because the wires are still up. They used electric helpers in that era. Anyway, cool shot you probably haven't seen before. Now, a little tribute to an old friend of mine who passed away, unfortunately, a few years ago, Walt Grusula. Don't call him Grecula. Don't call him Grukalak. It was Walt Grusula, and he was an electrician for the Great Northern Railway. And this is a cool photo because it's got great modeler's interest of the Bern Depot. Bern, of course, was just outside the east portal of the Cascade Tunnel. Tiny little depot. You can buy a model in the company store. You're welcome, Mac. Give me my $10 for that that promo. But I'll be modeling Bern, and Walt's service vehicle is in the foreground here. So nice modeler choice if you want. That looks like a late 1940s something or other. I'm not a car guy, but it's kind of a van with the Great Northern logo on it. Bern looking west. And then I have a purpose in showing this photo too. Bob Kelly did a nice job pointing out and encouraging people to look beyond the obvious sources when you're doing your research. So yes, the volunteers at the archives work very hard, and we have lots and lots of resources, and As near as I can tell, there are um, more online photos on the Great Northern and NP joint sites by a wide margin than any other railroad historical site. I mean, there's 40 or 50,000 photos up there, and and even more plat maps and so forth. So, although the software is getting upgraded and SharePoint's getting a little tired, the resources are amazing. That said, though, don't stop there. And Bob gave an example from a collection, somewhere else in Texas, actually. Now, here's an example of something that's online, has nothing to do with the Great Northern, but it's an example of being resourceful. This is from the Barriger collection. It's GN slide number 352. That is an archive that's based in St. Louis. And the archivist there has been good enough to post most of their photos online via Flickr, I believe, which is a little awkward because you don't really get reliable metadata, but his idea was, let's just get it out there and let people take advantage. And if you go to the GN group on groups.io, or if you're not sure, just send an email to archives@gnrhs.org. We can point you to this resource. There's hundreds of vintage Great Northern photos taken by John Barriger on his various trips around the country. Now, this is earlier than my era. You can see by the hats and so forth. This is likely in the 1930s, but it's a super high resolution photo of Kashmir looking west with lots of great detail for modeling. Yes, okay. And then Wenatchee, lots of good photos of Wenatchee, typically of the depot, typically of an electric, but this is a shot of the Cascadian eastward. And a beautiful shot with some F units on the front. And you can see to the left, that is not the depot. That white building was actually a baggage and express room, and the brick depot is out of view in the distance behind that. So if you're modeling
that building was actually the REA building.
The Railway Express Agency. Yep, yeah. Express. And then, Mac, what was the building on the other side? The little one, was that a lunchroom?
The big building on the right is the Cascadian fruit warehouse. It's still there. They claim to be able to store 1,000 carloads of apples, which would be around 600,000 bushel boxes of apples.
And then, Mac, on the other side of the brick depot, there was a smaller brick building. What was that used for?
That was the lunchroom.
That's what I thought. That's out of view, but Mac's on the line, so I got to ask him the good questions while I got him. So on that prototypical theme, here's an example of the paperwork we're using. This is an actual timetable from 1951 in this case, but you can see on the timetable itself, the stations are listed with, in this case, Wenatchee on the top and Seattle on the bottom. This is the eastward half of the timetable with trains heading east. And, I didn't want to show the whole thing on screen, but you can get the idea of what's going on. And people often just look at the times, but you've also got distances on here. You've got a set of codes on the right. The right-hand column says signs. And those codes all mean something. They refer to whether water is available, whether there's a Y, whether there's a yard at that location, whether it's a 24-hour station, which is designated by DN, or whether it's day only, which means you just have a D, and that refers to the operators working there. So a great example, I know I'm getting in the weeds, but it's just an example of the kind of insanity we get into in our research. If you look at Grotto, about a third of the way down on the left side, and then track your eyes to the right, it says DP, and it doesn't say DNP. And Grotto is a station in 1951 that was only had an operator in the daytime. So anyway, good stuff. A lot of detail in these employee timetables. There are scans of I believe over 1,000 employee timetables online now at the Joint Archives site. Either you can remember gn-np-jointarchive.org, or just go to gnrhs.org and sort through the menus for archives, and we'll link you out there. I highlight that because we still get a lot of requests for employee timetables, and they're not aware that those have been online for about a year now. And it's also a chance to really thank the other historical societies. There's been times on and off where, I hear snide little remarks made by the NPR or about the NPRHA or others. These were all scanned by an NPRHA volunteer named Hudson Leighton. He did Great Northern, he did Northern Pacific, he did Milwaukee. He scanned thousands of timetables. It was an enormous amount of work, easily over 1,000 hours of work over about a 3-year period. And he just gave them to us. So hats off to the NPRHA. Here now, this is not, again, a lesson in timetable and train order, but we are replicating this paperwork on my model railroad. What you see before your eyes is an example of a form every operating railroader was familiar with, the Form 19 train order. And in this case, it says after extra something something arrives at St. Cloud, run St. Cloud to Rockville and return. There are a bunch of standard forms used by dispatchers, not the paper form, but formats of train orders that were considered accepted or acceptable by the rule book and the dispatcher's manual. And then you had a clearance form, which is a little white thing to the right of the green form. And that was essentially a cover sheet. And it told the train crew, hey, in your hand now, you should have one order number 29. It literally says, I have one order for your train, number 29. If you looked at this clearance form and it mentioned 2 orders and you only had one order in your hand, by rule, you stopped your train because you did not have a complete set of orders. So it's a very important bit of belt and suspender rules to allow train crews to run safely. I mean, this is a topic that can and did took dozens of hours or hundreds of hours to really understand. And every operating railroad in this era, railroader, knew those rules. And it sounds like work, but it's actually really fun to run this way. I've got a crew of volunteers. We more or less use this system, and it's kind of fun. And it allows the train crews to think as opposed to just wait for a green signal. And then on the right, we have a vintage Great Northern switch list. And we fill those out and use the actual forms to run the railroad. And this is an eye chart, if there ever was one. I don't expect you to really discern this on your screens unless you have really big screens, but this is an example of a train sheet. And this particular one is a Northern Pacific train sheet. And this is what dispatchers used in their daily work to dispatch trains in an era, before CTC, where you couldn't communicate directly with trains, at least until the 50s, and on some railroads even later. And you communicated via operators working along the line who reported trains passing. And as those trains passed, the dispatcher would write down on this sheet the time that train went by the station or arrived and departed if it was doing work there. So in the columns, if you look to the right of the list of stations, you can see barely at the very head, it gives you the train number, 422, 460, 408, and then the times that the trains passed each station. Now, this is relevant to my railroad because trains did leave Interbay Yard heading to Portland on trackage rights over the NP. And I've modeled a brief section of NP from King Street south. And so, we do have trains leaving Interbay and passing King Street Station and heading south on the NP double track. We don't dispatch it, it goes straight to staging. But these train sheets were useful because it showed me, again, you can't discern it on your screens, but it showed me where the Great Northern trains ran and how often they ran and so forth. So pretty cool stuff. All right, we're going to move to the railroad now. So some givens here. I actually, this railroad is built into a purpose-built building. It's about 3,000 square feet. It's got radiant heat. I pay almost nothing to heat it because it's mostly underground. Show you that in a minute. It's basically a daylight basement where the roof is a sport court. So, it was quite a project, but it wasn't as expensive to build as you might imagine because we designed it to be easy to build. It's a hole in the ground with a roof, essentially. But I intentionally made a high ceiling, 9.5-foot suspended ceiling, so I'd have room to do double deck and mushroom construction, which I'll show you. The main line will be over 1,000 feet ultimately. As I mentioned, some double deck and mushroom construction. I set my siding length, and I'll pause on this for those of you designing railroads. Your siding length has significant effect on your operating model. Just as in the real railroad, if you got a siding that's 5 feet here and 18 feet there and 13 feet there, and that 5-foot siding's in a critical spot, your train length is now 5 feet. You can't pass a train any longer without a saw by. So it's wise to think in advance what your standard train length is. And in this case, we set it at 18 feet, which is pretty generous. It allows a 32-car train plus locomotive and caboose. The minimum radius, I wanted to take advantage of the space and set it fairly high so that passenger trains would look good. You wouldn't have lots of overhang. And I went further and set the minimum at 48-inch radius on outside curves, meaning curves you're viewing from the outside, because that's where you can really see the gaps between diaphragms. And the trains look a little goofy if you've got tight curves. Ruling grade is the same as the real thing. And then here's the other consideration on big railroads is aisle widths. The late John Armstrong would publish track plans in model railroader that frequently had 24-inch wide aisles as the standard. Well, I had the luck to meet John Armstrong at a conference late in his life, and that guy was thin as a rail, and everything became clear to me. I do not recommend 24-inch wide aisles for normal people. Dispatching I covered. I use NCE DCC, and we'll take a look at the motive power. All right. I mentioned building this building. I dug up these photos from the early days. It's basically a boat. It's a concrete boat. So you're looking at early construction here. You can see the concrete walls and concrete floor. We have already embedded the radiant heating in that concrete floor. And like I say, it's a big basement. Just needs a roof in this photo. Now here we've got that roof on. One cool thing is that a particular post in the middle of the picture is one of just 2 in the entire building. We planned it out so that we wouldn't have a lot of obstructions in the way of the railroad, which meant I had to develop my track plan in advance, which I actually don't recommend if you're not an engineer and you're not really organized. A lot of guys build very fine model railroads kind of winging it. That wouldn't have worked here, but to each his own. You got to build what you're comfortable with. So here's the entrance, which is kind of cool. Looks a bit like a depot entrance or perhaps a German bunker protecting the coast of Normandy. But there's no long guns situated here. I think Puget Sound is fairly safe at this moment. But that's the entrance. And then on top, you can see a little patio area. All right, let's see. Let me check something real quick. 11:35. Okay, we're doing good. All right, let's skip ahead. So the track plan, I'm going to start with just a kind of a zoomed in area. What you're seeing on the bottom of your screen is Inner Bay Yard, which characteristically, the real thing is essentially a big S curve. It's straight in the middle, and there's a wide sweeping curve at the north end, going by the roundhouse, and another wide sweeping curve at the south end to align back with Puget Sound. And we managed to model that here. And I noticed that S curve, and I'm like, boy, I'm in trouble. It's a lot easier to build model railroads along the wall. What am I going to do? And then I noticed that King Street Station has kind of a similar setup. The track goes out of the tunnel heading south, the double track, and then it makes this diagonal bend. Those of you who have been to King Street know what I'm talking about. And it just hit me like a bolt of lightning. I could put those in the same room side by side and have a diagonal aisle. And it fit beautifully. I claim no particular genius here, just the railroad kind of helped me out. But we'll see this live in a minute, the way King Street and Inner Bay interlock. But the happy thing is, because of this, I was able to essentially model King Street Station full size. And not just the station building, which you'll see, but the tracks. And that ends up mattering too. People will say, well, selective compression, maybe you make your tracks half length. Well, the problem is the Empire Builder was a particular length, and the NP 408 was a particular length. And if I hadn't modeled those track lengths full length, I couldn't run the railroad. So this is one area where I did not compress. Now, interbay yard, of course, is compressed. That's, 3/4 of a mile long, and my yard is not that long, but it's pretty big and big enough for a model railroad. So yes, they meshed naturally. The cool thing is that with this design, the yard operators get their own aisle. They will stand in the area at the very bottom, and they're out of the way when people are picking up their trains. And I've already seen the benefit of this in the op sessions. So a guy's going to take a train out of interbay yard. They walk up near the roundhouse, and the yard master hands the paperwork over that little neck on the left, and they start running their trains. You don't have this, human congestion you often see on model railroads around the yard, which is pretty cool. Okay, it was difficult to build. I ended up having to use the 2.2 ceiling grid as kind of a checkpoint, and used a laser plumb to transfer the grid onto the benchwork and get all these curves in. And in fact, this curvy area of interbay yard, I could not have, aligned that by hand. I actually used an engineering plotter to plot out the track full size, overlaid it on the grid, used a pounce wheel to transfer the lines onto the plywood. And that way I could lay the track and get it to align. And that technique worked beautifully. I didn't invent it, but it's really cool. So now I'm going to use the cool laser pointer feature of, let's see, where is it here? Of PowerPoint. Yeah, there it is. And first I'm going to give you a visual run over the line, and then we'll go look at the real thing. So my laser pointer now is circling around King Street Station. Let's say you're the Cascadian, you're leaving King Street. You exit through the North End complex and go into the downtown tunnel, which, is still in use today by BNSF. You go around this hidden area, a loop, and you'll pop out right here. So the operator doesn't have to move very far. And you're now going around the curve near Smith Cove at the south end of Interbay Yard. And now we reach the Interbay Yard complex. Little known fact was, through the late 60s, the NP had a small yard in Interbay, part of their branch line out to North Bend. So I have modeled a portion of the NP main line and their small yard there. And there's a small transfer yard between GN and NP. But here, the bulk of this, of course, is Great Northern. So you got Interbay Yard, Interbay Roundhouse. Now you leave Interbay, you go past that ice house I showed you a picture of earlier, and you head out on the main. You'll cross Salmon Bay on the famous Bridge 4 drawbridge, go through Ballard, and now we're on the double track following Puget Sound. So you curl around here, you go through Point Wells where the oiler switches, lots of oil cars. You go past Union Oil just south of Edmonds, and we reach Edmonds. Got a beautiful model of the Edmonds Depot circa 1955, built by my friend Don Treadle. And now we reach Everett Junction. And here's the split I talked about here. If you take the coastline, you go down the lower level, and you'll go just to the tip of Bayview Yard or Bayside Yard, and go down a helix into staging for Vancouver. If you take the High Line, you go here and now go through this tunnel portal, which represents the real tunnel under Everett, and you'll pop out on the backside of Everett, the Pacific Avenue area. Now we go by Lowell, which is the junction where the trackage rights trains of the NP and Milwaukee join Great Northern, and we start going through foothill country. We go through Snohomish, which is where the NP exited. We'll go all the way down this wall to Monroe, which I showed you a map earlier, and Monroe Junction, which is where the Milwaukee exited. They'll go down a ramp to their own little staging yard representing Cedar Falls. Now the main line follows these interior walls. We go through Gold Bar, which was a storage yard. We're climbing. We're now at index at 65 inches off the floor. We go through Bering, Grotto, which is the site of a major cement plant. And at this point, we're 72 inches off the floor, and I will show you what happens on the second level. But this is the point in the presentation where we move to live stuff. So let me, now how do I turn the laser pointer off is the question. Maybe I hit it again. There we go. Let's take a tour. All right. This is the part that could get tricky. So I'm going to turn off the screen share and turn on my share of this video. Let's see. So I now have video, and Tom, because I'm talking, can people see my face? Am I highlighted at the moment?
Yes, you're visible.
Okay, good. So I'm going to flip the camera, and now you'll see in a moment. You see my keyboard.
Yep. Yep.
And you see my screen. Very good.
Yep.
Okay, here we go. Let's take a tour. Tom, what time is it?
22.
Okay, good. We're fine. So I'll make this brief but fun. Here's the crew lounge. Nice little area. Features, among other things, some seats extracted from an Empire Builder coach that I reupholstered. It is a beautiful day. Oh, what happened? Am I still live?
Yeah, as you're live, somebody bumped into you.
Okay. What happened there?
Oh, you got bumped. Maybe if you just reshare your screen, I think we might fix that.
Well, it's not actually a share, it's just my video. Let me stop and start. What is going on here?
Looking. Hold
It's
on.
going so well. Who is that? Is somebody sharing their screen?
Yes.
Okay, they need to stop sharing or this won't work.
With John Wesley's screen.
John, please stop sharing your screen.
Wesley.
Calling John Wesley. Ah, there we go. Thank you, John.
Sorry about that.
It happens.
Okay, I was about to say it is and John, please mute. Beautiful day in Puget Sound. Tom, can you see my screen okay again, or my video again?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Here.
Okay, so let's start in the Seattle room. And I found for orientation, it's easiest to start at King Street Station. So here you can see the coach yard, which was one of my pandemic projects. And the NP Main Streeter and 408 are laying over. Now we approach King Street, and you can see the what is the south end of the terminal complex. And now we're approaching King Street Station itself and the station building. And this is a building that I worked with a guy in Baltimore named Jeff Springer. It's so complicated, the detail of the building, that the only way we could figure out to build a great model of King Street in our lifetime was to laser etch it into acrylic. So that's what we did. And we could never get the colors right until we figured that, or we realized that King Street has bond bricks, the bricks that where you see the ends, and they're much darker than the bricks you see from the side. And to really get the texture, we had to hand paint those with a 000 brush. But it leads to, it may not be showing on my, your screens, but it led to a really beautiful effect. And it is a full-size model of King Street. I don't have the platforms in place yet because we're still debugging the track. We want it to be perfect. But a train will, of course, leave through this complex, and kind of a point of pride. Not all the trackage here is hand laid, but a lot of it is. And at the north end of King Street, you can see we've got a double slip and a single slip switch with moving center points for reliability, which was, well, it was a huge pain, but I'm glad I did it because it leads to absolutely reliable operation. Now, let's run a train just to prove we can. This is the Cascadian, led by a couple of FTs that many of you have seen from previous Great Northern Conventions, because they were Stewart units, super detailed by Dwayne Buck, complete with the spark arresters up on the top, and just beautiful locomotives. And we've got a nice version of the Cascadian, including a nice version of the 1060 that John Wesley helped me out with. But all together, it's a nice looking train. And let's see where this guy goes. So Clint Crow, as some of you know, did an actual model of the tunnel portal in Seattle, which I've weathered up. You don't see much other scenery, but this train's going to disappear. And we'll return to him later, but he'll move around. I'm going to jump ahead and show you the main line here, curling around Smith Cove. And now we get into Inter Bay Yard. This was my other big pandemic project. It includes, I think, 35 hand laid turnouts, and the number 6 is our microengineering. But you know, it was a big project. And then here you see that small Northern Pacific yard. It's actually one of the most popular jobs on the layout because it's a real interesting switching puzzle. This is NP Crossing, where the Northern Pacific dock line serving the Navy docks crossed 4 tracks of the Great Northern. And again, a piece of track work that took a lot of patience. So now we'll proceed through Interbay. We'll walk around where the turntable pit will be. A friend is doing some a 3D printed version of the Interbay turntable. So all you see right now is a box and a bunch of junk, but you know, we're getting there. And then recall from that earlier picture of the caboose track in Interbay. This is that view. I'll move my phone over here. That's essentially the view you saw in that earlier picture. And we have the Cascadian coming around the corner. And then here, no ice house yet, but you can see the icing track that I showed you earlier serving Interbay. So now the Cascadian is approaching. I'm going to circle around and go through this little walk under into the other room. And you'll see the placeholder bridge for the Ballard drawbridge. And now we curl around, as I demonstrated earlier. The double track is now following Puget Sound. We'll curl around this corner, trying to be mindful of time. I think the Cascadian will catch us eventually. It is a model railroad after all. Here is the switching for Point Wells, all the oil cars I mentioned earlier. Excuse me, the Unical facility in Edmonds. The location of the Edmonds Depot is coming up in a moment, but wait, it says Skykomish. Well, I haven't built Skykomish yet, so it's a placeholder, but it's a beautiful model available from the Great Northern Railroad Historical Society store. Now we'll continue along the main line, double track main line, and we get to Everett Junction. And by the way, a kind of a pro tip, there's so much good stuff available online. There are online sign makers that will make these beautiful looking, you know, etched plastic signs for not very much money. I ended up finding a good supplier and I just had them create signs for every major area on the railroad. And it looks really nice. So here's Everett Junction with some early controls for the switches. And as mentioned, this is the area where you split high line and low line. And so the high line in front of the Everett Depot is currently the home of a beautiful Empire builder. The low line has a reefer block from Vancouver heading south, headed by the 2120, waiting in Everett siding. But here you can see the Empire builder. That is a Shoreham Shops version of the Empire builder with the good paint, resolving all questions of what Dulux gold actually looks like. I think Doug Bauer nailed it in his model of the Empire builder. Walther's got close, but these models are, in my opinion, perfect. And then you go through the tunnel, no portal yet, and you know, not visible there. You pop out on the other side, and here's Everett, PA, with an R2 heading a train that's in siding at Everett Pacific Avenue. Now, one brief thing to show, which has nothing to do with the prototype, but it's just a point of pride or insanity, is something I call the blender. So let's step up here and look at this helix complex. I'm not sure I would do this again, but there are let me count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 levels currently, and a 7th will be going in here. It's the helix down to staging. At the very lowest level, you can see just a hint of an arc. That's the turnback curve for the Northern Pacific staging yard. 3 levels of helix, and then across the top is the main line I've just been showing you. Later, there'll be a second deck that goes up here, but that was a piece of work, and I'm glad I built it when I was younger. So trains that go down go through this length of track and into, oops, hold on. Okay, good. Into staging yard for Vancouver. Here's another modeler's tip. Keep things simple on your construction. I have a very simple rotary switch, and people just, I took the labels off because I repainted this, but you just turn the switch to set the track you want, and it's a double pole rotary, so it turns on track power as well. None of this stuff using panels and buttons and all that. I found when you have visiting operators, they want things to be super simple so they can focus on the railroading and not whatever weird technique you built up with your electronics. And now we're following bench work. So here's the part that's still under construction. We're passing through Snohomish. At the far end of this aisle is Monroe. And for time, I'm just going to stop here and follow the bench work back. Now you follow the bench work back, and we are actually climbing. It's not easy to see. You walk around here. You get to Gold Bar. The track continues climbing, eventually enters this other room, which I'll raise the foam to show you. This is currently the cut room, table saw and all that. Index will be in here, and you eventually get to, I'm just going to fast forward, you eventually get to Skykomish. Now, how did we build Skykomish? Skykomish is an upper level of bench work, but it's mushroomed over this aisle. So if I step up here, that is where Skykomish Yard goes. It's 73 inches off the floor. Well, how's anybody going to reach that? The answer is a raised floor in this room. You will access Skykomish from this side. You can see the supports being built for the backdrop. So in this room, you're viewing the main line out of Monroe, and that's the only scene you see. In the other room, you'll be viewing this upper scene from the other side. So wherever you are, you only see one scene at a time. And then for people that know Skykomish, this just worked out well. It's better to be lucky than good. This is the tail track of that Skykomish Y. 73 inches, most people just walk right under it. And if I ever get an R2 stuck on this tail track, that's fine. Just build a little window in here so we can reach it. So anyway, that's a quick version of a tour of the railroad. I'm going to return to the presentation, and then we'll have time for questions. How are we on time now, Tom?
1 minute.
1 minute. Oh, 1 minute for questions or 1 minute to end?
1 minute to end, and then you have questions for 5 minutes.
All right, let me turn the video off and questions now. That's fine. All right, go ahead.
Hey, Dan, you're up.
So looking through a few of the comments here, somebody had mentioned the Burlington and the Santa Fe had the other pendulum coaches.
That sounds right.
Ron Farrell says he bought the last burn depot kit from the company store.
Thanks a lot.
Jim Lancaster said, I rode the pendulum car on the International from Blaine to Vancouver, BC in the early 1950s. Ed says those 3 GP7s are all passenger equipped units, the ones that we saw at Skykomish.
That's right.
And Brent Hart says, I think anyone that has done a Helix has said that I'm not sure I'll do it again. John Barth just added, what will you be using for catenary?
Great question. So for catenary, my current plan is to do poles only. A friend of mine, Lee Marsh, in the area has done that in his layout, and you don't even notice the catenary is missing, and now you don't have problems with operators snagging their sleeves on wires.
There are no other questions in the chat.
Open it to the floor.
Go back. How are you managing to keep all that track clean? And then what code of track are you using?
It's a mix of code 70 and 83. I use 83 on the double track, and everywhere else it's 70 with even some code 55 on spurs. But the secret to keeping it clean is, first of all, set up a clean environment. So it's a suspended ceiling, You know, it's you know, a nice carpeted building. I vacuum regularly. One of the things I decided to do early was not to have a messy construction situation and then carpet later. I decided to build a clean environment from the start. So my cut room is separate. It's got an air cleaner. It's walled off from the rest of the layout. In fact, I do a lot of cutting outdoors. So I just keep the room clean. I've also got a couple of HEPA air filters that I run. So the dust is relatively minimal. I don't ever have to run track cleaning cars. The other key is to run your layout regularly. So generally that's been enough and I've not had problems. And then on the locomotives, I always recommend, whether you have dirty track or clean track, you know, installing keep alives. When you install DCC, that helps as well.
One more comment here is I'm modeling N scale and have a large oblong helix, as you mentioned. Not sure I'd do that again.
But I'm glad I did it because I like what it got for me. Just, you know, once was enough.
Joel McCurry says, do those two boys help you?
A little bit. One is not interested, but Nick, the youngest, is 16 and he's been helping a little. I also have a crew of about 5 that at least before the pandemic would come over once a month. You could never build something like this alone.
All
Well,
right, that's
thank you very much, Bill. It's been an excellent presentation.
Great. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
You're most welcome. Thank you for being part of this.
yes.